The diesel engine of my old Ford was still rattling, sending a thin plume of white smoke into the crisp mountain air when I saw the flashing lights reflecting in the rearview mirror, and I hadn't oppos to even kill the ignition yet. I've been back on my family's land for exactly 6 minutes, standing there with my hands tucked into the pockets of a worn flight jacket, breathing in the scent of damp earth and cedar that I'd missed for 24 years. But apparently, the welcoming committee at Silver Pine Lake worked faster than a tactical response team. I watched as this woman, and I mean, she looked like she'd stepped straight out of a luxury catalog with her platinum blonde hair sprayed into a rigid helmet and heels so sharp they looked like they could puncture a tire, marched across the gravel driveway with her phone pressed to her ear like she was calling in an airstrike. She didn't oppose to even look at me. She just pointed a manicured finger at my truck, her voice shrill enough to cut through the mountain silence, saying, in quote, "Yes, officer, he oppose. That's right here, the vagrant I told you about, the one trying to occupy the condemned structure." End quote. I just stood there, my boots crunching on the familiar grit of the driveway my grandfather had paved with his own hands back in the late 50s, and I felt this slow, cold burn starting in my chest as the deputy climbed out of his cruiser, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. This wasn't an oppos, just some cabin to me. It was the, end quote, nest, end quote, the place where my old man taught me how to clean a trout, and where my Uncle Silas, a man who survived the chosen reservoir with nothing but grit and a frozen rifle, had spent his final years carving wooden ducks and telling me that a man's home is the only fortress that truly matters. When Silas passed away while I was finishing my final tour in Germany, he left me this place, not just the wood and the stone, but the peace he'd fought for. And yet here I was being treated like a trespasser on the only square inch of the planet where I felt I actually belonged. The deputy approached, his hand resting casually but firmly on his belt, and he gave me that look, the one that says, in quote, "I'm just doing my job, but you're making it difficult," in quote. And he asked for my ID, ignoring the fact that I was standing on my own porch. End quote. "Sir, we've had a report of an unauthorized squatter at this address, and Mrs. Sterling here, the president of the Silver Pine Homeowners Association, says there's an active injunction against any occupancy of this lot," end quote. He said, and I could see Mrs. Sterling, Evelyn, as I later learned to call her, smirking from behind his shoulder, her eyes scanning my old truck and my duffel bags with a kind of visceral disgust. I handed him my military ID and the deed transfer papers, my voice calm but hard as a rusted nail, telling him that this was my home, inherited from Silas Thorne, and that I wasn't an oppos going anywhere. But Evelyn stepped forward, the smell of expensive perfume clashing horribly with the pine needles, and she hissed, end quote, "That deed is subject to the covenants of this community, Mr. Thorne, and this shack is a blight that has an end oppos. Seen a paintbrush since the Nixon administration, so you can either leave quietly or we can have the sheriff's department escort you to the county line," end quote. I looked around at the neighboring houses, these massive $5 million glass and steel monstrosities that looked like they'd been dropped by an alien civilization onto the shoreline, and I realized the Silver Pine I grew up in was dead. The modest fishing cottages were gone, replaced by, end quote, aesthetic standards, end quote, and, end quote, investment protection, end quote, and I was the last thumb in the eye of a woman who wanted to turn this entire lake into a gated playground for people who didn't oppose know how to bait a hook. The deputy sighed, checked my papers, and told me that while the deed looked legitimate, the HOA had filed a, end quote, public safety and aesthetic nuisance, end quote, stay with the court, meaning until a judge cleared it, I couldn't oppose. Actually moved my stuff inside, so I spent my first night back in my hometown sleeping in the bed of my truck, staring up at the stars and realizing that after 2 decades of fighting foreign wars, the hardest battle of my life was going to be fought right here on my own front lawn. By the 3rd day, the harassment moved from, end quote, annoying, end quote, to, end quote, surgical, end quote, because Evelyn Sterling didn't oppose. Just wanted me gone. She wanted me erased, and she started by sending a certified letter that was thicker than my last deployment briefing. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored stationery with a gold emboss seal that probably cost more than my monthly pension, and it listed, end quote, mandatory remediation requirements, end quote. That made my head spin. I had 30 days to replace the cedar siding with, end quote, approved composite stone, end quote. Install a localized irrigation system. Pave the gravel drive with stamped concrete, and end quote. Decommission, end quote, the hand-built stone chimney because it didn't end oppos to meet the new emissions code. The estimated cost for these, end quote, minor updates, end quote, was $85,000, which was funny, considering Silas lived there for 50 years without a single complaint. But as Evelyn told me when she caught me checking the mail, end quote, we have a certain caliber of resident to protect here. Silas, and you're into oppos, rustic char and oppos, is dragging down the appraisal value of the Smithson estate next door by at least 10%, end quote. I realized then that this wasn't and oppos tea about the paint or the chimney. It was a war of attrition designed to bleed me dry until I had no choice but to sell the land to the, end quote, Silver Pine Development Group, end quote, which, surprise, surprise, was owned by Evelyn's husband, Marcus. They were clearing out the, end quote, old guard, end quote, one by one, using the HOA as a legal bludgeon to bankrupt anyone who didn't end oppos to fit the new lake vibe. But they made one massive mistake. They assumed that because I was a, end quote, simple soldier, end quote, I didn't end oppos to know how to do my reconnaissance. I spent my mornings at the county records office, sitting in a basement that smelled like dust and forgotten promises, digging through land surveys and HOA charters dating back to the 1940s, and that in oppos. That's where I met Clara. Clara was 82, had hair the color of wood smoke, and she'd been a county clerk since before I was born. She remembered Silas, remembered how he used to bring her jars of blackberry jam every summer. And when I told her what the HOA was doing, she leaned over the counter and whispered, end quote, honey, those Sterlings think they own the water, but they forgot that the water has a very long memory, end quote. She pulled out a drawer of, end quote, restricted access, end quote, maps from 1952, maps that Warren and oppos digitized, maps that showed the original boundaries of the lake before the dam was raised, and she pointed to a red line that ran right through the middle of my property. End quote. See this? This is A and oppos, riparian sovereign easement, and oppos, and it means that for the first 12 lots on this shore, the land rights aren't in oppos. Just about the dirt. They're tied to the original flow of the creek, and Silas was one of the 3 men who signed the oppos, Common Ground Treaty in oppos, before the HOA even existed. End quote. It turns out the HOA was formed in 1988, but the Thorne property, my property, had a, end quote, supremacy clause, end quote, in the original deed that Silas had hidden in plain sight. It stated that as long as a direct descendant of the Thorne family occupied the land, the property was exempt from any future, end quote, aesthetic or structural governance, end quote, by any third-party corporation. I had the legal equivalent of a nuclear deterrent in my pocket, but I wasn't into oppos, too ready to fire it yet, because I wanted to see how far Evelyn would go, and boy, she didn't end oppos, to disappoint. A week later, I came back from a supply run to find a, end quote, stop work, end quote, order taped to my door, and a crew of men in bright orange vests standing on my dock with chainsaws, led by Marcus Sterling himself, who was pointing at the ancient oak tree Silas had planted when my father was born. End quote. This tree is a hazard, Mr. Thorne. Its roots are threatening the communal sewer line, end quote. Marcus said, not even looking me in the eye, just checking his watch like I was a minor inconvenience on his schedule. I walked up to him, feeling that old military, end quote, switch, end quote, flip in the back of my brain, the one that makes everything go very quiet and very sharp. And I told him that if he touched that tree, I'd have him arrested for felony property damage before the first branch hit the water. He laughed, a dry, condescending sound, and told me that the HOA, end quote, managed, end quote, all timber within 50 feet of the shoreline. But then I pulled out the 1952 map and the supremacy clause, and I watched the color drain from his face so fast, I thought he was going to faint in the heat. End quote. You see this line, Marcus? That's the sovereign easement, end quote. I said, my voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that used to make privates shake in their boots. End quote. This land, ISN and oppos, part of your little kingdom, and according to the state charter, your HOA has been illegally taxing this lot for 32 years, which means not only am I not paying your oppos, remediation fees, and oppos, but you actually owe the Thorne estate about $40,000 in back refunds plus interest, end quote. Evelyn arrived then, her heels clicking like a countdown timer on the pavement. And when Marcus whispered what I'd found, she didn't in oppose. T backed down, she doubled down, screaming that she'd have the cabin declared a biohazard and burned to the ground before she let a, end quote, broken down grunt, end quote, ruin her community standards. That was the moment I stopped being, end quote, polite, end quote, and started being a, end quote, master sergeant, end quote. I didn't oppose. T just have the deed. I started digging into the HOA and oppos as financial disclosures, which are public record if you know which doors to kick down, and I found a trail of, end quote, maintenance contracts, end quote, paid out to Marcus Sterling's construction firm that totaled nearly $500,000 over 3 years. Contracts for work that was never done, for, end quote, lake treatments, end quote, that were actually just bags of cheap lime thrown into the reeds. I reached out to the other, end quote, old-timers, end quote, on the lake, the ones Evelyn had been bullying into silence. People like Old Man Miller, who was being fined $50 a day because his mailbox was the, end quote, wrong shade of forest green, end quote, and we had a little meeting in my, end quote, shack, end quote, by the light of a kerosene lamp. We formed our own, end quote, legacy committee, end quote, and we didn't in oppose. T file a lawsuit. We filed a, end quote, quo warranto, end quote, petition, which basically challenges the very right of the HOA to exist in its current form. We showed that the Sterlings had been using the HOA as a personal piggy bank to fund their own development projects. And when a local news caught wind of a, end quote, veteran fighting for his family's legacy against corrupt developers, end quote, the Sterlings' world started to crumble faster than a cheap sandcastle. The night before the big community hearing, someone, I'm not saying who, but he had a very expensive Mercedes, tried to, end quote, accidentally, end quote, back a boat trailer into my porch, but they didn't into oppos. T realized I'd spent my, end quote, shack time, end quote, installing a high-definition, solar-powered security perimeter. I had the whole thing on 4K video. Marcus Sterling's personal assistant trying to sabotage a veteran's home. The hearing at the community center was packed, and Evelyn was there in a power suit, looking like she was ready to deliver a eulogy for my cabin, but I didn't in oppos. T give a speech about, end quote, aesthetic standards, end quote. I just walked up to the podium in my full dress uniform, metals polished, back straight as a yardstick, and I played the video of the sabotage, followed by the 1952 map, and then I dropped the bombshell, the, end quote, Thorne Treaty, end quote, didn't in oppos. T just exempt my lot, it actually granted the Thorne family the right of, end quote, final approval, end quote, on any commercial development within 5 miles of the lake center point. The look on Evelyn's face wasn't an oppos. T just anger anymore. It was pure, unadulterated terror because she realized that her husband's multi-million-dollar, end quote, marina expansion, end quote, project wasn't an oppos. T just delayed. It was effectively dead unless I signed off on it, and I told the entire room, loud and clear, that I'd sooner sign my own death warrant than let them touch 1 more inch of our lake. In the end, the HOA board was dissolved by a court-appointed receiver. The Sterlings are currently under investigation for racketeering and embezzlement, and Marcus's company is bankrupt from the legal fees. I'm sitting on my porch now, the one they called a, end quote, blight, end quote, and the air smells like pine and freedom again. I've got my grandfather's old rocking chair going, and the oak tree is still standing tall, casting a long shadow over the water where the trout are finally jumping again. But here's the thing that gets me. Even after all the evidence, after the videos and the maps and the corruption, there are still people in this town who think I'm the villain, who think I ruined the, end quote, property value, end quote, and, end quote, the dream, end quote, by not just falling in line and letting the rich folks have their way. It makes me wonder, when did we decide that a, end quote, standardized look, end quote, was more important than a family's history? When did we start letting people in designer suits tell us what our homes are allowed to look like? I stood my ground because Silas taught me that once you let someone take an inch of your dignity, they'll come back for the whole mile. But I want to know what you guys think. Was I being, end quote, unreasonable, end quote, for blocking a multi-million-dollar development that could have, end quote, helped, end quote, the local economy? Or is a man's home really his castle, no matter how many HOA Karens try to storm the gates? Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever had a fight, in quote, power-hungry neighbor, in quote. Or if you think I should have just taken the $85,000 hit and kept the peace, because honestly, looking out at this water, I don and oppose to regret a single second of the fight. But I'm curious if you'd have the guts to do the same if they came for your front door.